Is Sandra Gland's new book, Nobody's Mother, a game changer in this seemingly unending debate around 1 Timothy 2 and complementarianism and egalitarianism? Or is it, so to speak, preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir? Well, let me tell you what I thought.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
Okay, I have here an advanced copy of Nobody's Mother by Sandra Glahn. Thank you to IVP for sending me a copy for review. I was very interested in this book based on what I knew about it, kind of as it was a forthcoming title, and an interview that I heard with her as well. Really intrigued me. So let me take you through my typical format of kind of the main idea of the book, the research, the readability, and then my reaction to it overall. Okay, so Nobody's Mother, the subtitle is Artemis of the Ephesians, which is important in Antiquity and the New Testament. Okay, so the main idea of this book is a study. It's actually primarily an historical study of the figure of Artemis in mythology and ancient writing. That's actually kind of the main objective of this book, which could be, I could see somebody missing that. I could see somebody thinking this is more of an exegetical study of 1 Timothy 2. It's not really that. It really is a study on Artemis, actually, which is kind of an important thing to know going into it. It has major implications, potentially, for the interpretation of 1 Timothy 2, but it is mostly about Artemis. So the main idea is essentially she is pushing back hard on kind of conventional knowledge or conventional wisdom around Artemis being perceived as a fertility goddess, a fertility figure. That's the primary thing she's really pushing against and trying to propose another view of how actually was Artemis perceived generally in antiquity, but more specifically in the city of Ephesus, which is relevant to 1 Timothy 2 because that epistle was written to Timothy in Ephesus as he was shepherding a community of Christians in that part of the ancient world. So it's majorly a study about Artemis and about kind of the context of Ephesus that provides background then for some comments and some potential implications for understanding that very, very strange phrase Paul uses in 1 Timothy 2 when he says women will be saved through childbearing. And that's another thing I want to say about the main idea is it's more primarily about that phrase, saved through childbearing, than it is about I am not permitting a woman to have authority or teach. So some people, I'm spending a lot of time on this main idea because I think it's really important to go into this book knowing what it is, or at least it's helpful, I think. It is a book about Artemis, and it's a book about the phrase saved through childbearing. It's not a book primarily exegetical, and it's not primarily about the phrase, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority. So that's the main idea. So it's a major lightning rod conversation, at least within, especially evangelical Christianity. People outside of the church, people outside of Christianity are probably going to be like rolling their eyes, like, what is the deal with all these books being written about this topic? But that text is so highly charged and so debated, and her study is going right into it with a very specific angle and a very specific laser focus on Artemis and the phrase saved through childbearing. So that's really what Nobody's Mother is about. That's the main idea, I would say. Okay, now let's get into some more of the content. So the research behind it, this surprised me a little bit. So I mentioned that I heard an interview with her before reading this, and she struck me as just extremely thoughtful, Sandra Glahn is what I'm talking about, extremely thoughtful, extremely intelligent, extremely well read, serious scholar, all of that stuff. But the research still surprised me a little bit in that it was so laser focused on Artemis, and especially, probably I think the longest chapter is really a strung together annotated list with some commentary of pretty much, I think it's literally every reference to Artemis in ancient literature. So that includes things like Homer's writings, ancient poetry, ancient mythology, ancient stories. It's just strung together. Here's where Artemis is referenced, and so here's a little anecdote about Artemis. Here's a little mythological story. Here's a little mythological reference to something that Artemis accomplished. Something that was attributed to her, for example. It's just the kind of backbone of the book is that, and then she steps all the way. It's really amazing. To me, it's amazing. She dug up all these references and strings them all together from antiquity, from like the oldest kind of writings that we have, all the way up through the New Testament and even kind of post-New Testament references. And also she dials in, after kind of the broad scope of references, she dials in specifically to references about Ephesus. And so she also pulls on Acts chapter 19, which is really important. So the kind of thrust of the research behind the book is really that project, to like uncover all these references to Artemis. She also does some research on, like, helpfully does a little bit of a literature review on here's what other people have said about, here's what some other scholars have said. And also she points out, she traces the development of the overarching conventional narrative of Artemis as a fertility goddess. So you can see where that comes from, and which is important for her project because she's really trying to refute that. So that's what the research is. It really surprised me. It's not the most, that chapter in particular where it is just that list of references, it's not like the most, it's not like reading a novel. It's not like an exciting read per se, but wow, is it really interesting. It's really helpful if you're willing to like work through that, especially seeing all that stuff back to back. It really, I would say it really, to tip my hand a little bit, it really paints a pretty persuasive portrait of how the ancients actually did think of Artemis. Okay, so that's the research. Now the readability, a couple things on this. It's actually quite short. It's a lot shorter than I was expecting when I opened it up. It's not a very long book, and it's not inscrutable at all. It's actually very easy to understand. However, like I just said, it is primarily this list of references, kind of an annotated list of references to Artemis, and that doesn't necessarily make for the most like electrifying reading in all cases. However, I will also say that she brings in, especially in the beginning, she brings in a lot of her own personal, who she is and her story, and kind of how she got so interested in this. And I'll let you read that story for yourself. So it's not just like a dry tome, but it kind of goes back and forth between personal story, commentary, and then that really, really in-depth research. So not all told the most like smoothest, easiest read per se, but also not really hard to push through that if you're particularly interested in the topic. Okay, now, my reaction to this. Okay, I've spent a lot of time kind of teeing this up. I'm going to say that I think this is a really important study overall. Some people I think are kind of wondering, is this a game changer? Is this kind of an open-shut case closed on the whole 1 Timothy 2 debate? I don't think anything at this point is going to be that. And I will say that this book does a few things extraordinarily well. First of all, if there can be anything said that this book accomplishes conclusively, if I can offer that, I think it actually does. I think it does conclusively refute the idea that Artemis was a fertility goddess. I think she very persuasively and comprehensively describes where that idea came from, why it is not convincing, and puts forward an alternative that is thorough, careful, studied, well presented, and convincing. And she puts forward this case that Artemis is far from a fertility goddess. She's actually more of a goddess about celibacy and virginity. And then also, importantly, there's this strong thread of Artemis serving a function in the ancient world of like protecting women, either protecting women through childbirth by keeping them safe, or protecting them by like painlessly kind of euthanizing them when they're in childbirth. Like it's fascinating. She goes really deep into all that stuff. And it is, I would say that part of the book is a paradigm shift. It's a game changer for understanding. If you really want to understand the background of Artemis of the Ephesians, Artemis of Ephesus, then man, this is like one-stop shop. It is an amazing study in that regard. So I think if anything can be said about this book being conclusive, it's that. And then secondly, kind of relating out of that, I think she makes a really... This is not going to be open and shut for everybody. It's definitely not going to be... I think the first thing really is kind of open and shut. I mean, I think the burden of proof is now going to be on anybody to say that she's wrong about the ancient conception of Artemis. Now, where it gets a little bit more potentially dicey is what she then interprets off of that into understanding that really weird phrase from Paul about being saved through childbearing. Now, I am someone who has always been convinced that there's odd or idiosyncratic, culturally contextual things happening around 1 Timothy 2. I've just always had that perspective. And so you could say in a way I was coming into this like really interested and open to see what she would bring to that. Someone who's more skeptical of that may wrestle with this in a different way than I did. But I have to say, I think that the idea that Artemis is this goddess who protects women, who either keeps them as virgins or celibate, can explain why there's so those weird references to widows and women in the bigger letter to Timothy. It explains potentially some of what's going on there. Maybe there were a lot of single women in Ephesus because of the influence of Artemis. Secondly, that phrase "saved through childbearing," her kind of to tip my hand to her conclusion. One of her big conclusions is that Paul is talking about being physically safe. not being like soteriologically saved, not being like salvation in the spiritual sense, which has led to a lot of odd conclusions from that text, saved through childbearing. But what if Paul is simply trying to implore women in Timothy's community in Ephesus, don't try to trust Artemis to keep you safe through childbearing, trust Christ. Like, what if that's kind of what Paul's getting at? And I think, I gotta say, Nobody's Mother makes a pretty good case. I don't know if everyone's going to be convinced fully. She doesn't really touch on the other really lightning rod side of that phrase about permitting women to teach and have authority. She doesn't really get into that, maybe as much as I maybe wish she would have, because that's another really important phrase. But in terms of understanding who Artemis was, the context of Ephesus, what might have been going on in Timothy's community, and then bringing it all to bear on that really strange phrase, to be saved through childbearing, wow, this book is really helpful, really important part of the conversation that if you want to have a really informed opinion on that text in particular, if you're in a community that's debating that text, if you find yourself in contentious conversations about that text in particular, Sandra Glahn's work, I would say, is essential to getting at that. Just know the kind of the way that the study is focused, the way it's circumscribed, what it's getting at, what it's not trying to get at. Know all that going in, and I think this is a remarkably helpful resource for the church, for ministry leaders, for anyone who just wants to wrap their mind around one of the most difficult texts in the New Testament. So there you go. A little bit longer than normal. I wanted to get a little bit more into the weeds on this one because of the nature of the study, and also because of the kind of charged nature of the discussion around the text at hand. But there you go. Those are my thoughts on Nobody's Mother by Sandra Glahn. Wow, quite a revelatory study within those parameters that I was laying out. So hopefully this helped you kind of understand what's going on in this book, or maybe this even introduced the book to you that you weren't even aware of or on your radar. But regardless, as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.